taking a look inside Kansas politics. Welcome in. I'm Rebecca Chung. Homelessness is an ongoing issue in Kansas, impacting communities across the state. The question is, what can be done to address the issue? We're following up with state and local leaders. Joining me today is Representative Francis Auerkamp, chair of the state's Special Committee on Homelessness. We also have Public Safety Policy Director Devin Kurtz with the Austin-based policy organization Cicero Institute. All right, let's start with a look at some takeaways from a poll that your organization released this year. Some background on this as well. This was paid for by Cicero Institute. It was also conducted by Core Strategies, Inc. from December 19th to December 23rd, 2023, and they describe themselves as the largest center-right political company in Illinois. Results were collected during a sampling framed from more than 1,500 Kansas voters during live calls, online panels, and automated telephone interviews. The margin of sampling error was also plus or minus 2.51 percentage points, and the margin of sampling error may be higher or lower for subgroups was also noted. So here's some of the results. 62% of all voters expressed the deepening worry about the increasing homelessness in Kansas. 63% see a need for increasing programs to address addiction and mental illness. Then also 57% agree that this would be more helpful than subsidized housing programs. 35% of voters say that Kansas Governor Laura Kelly is not doing a good job of managing homelessness in the state. Then it's also, or doing a good job rather, of managing homelessness in the state, so only 35%. Then it says that more than half would like to see major cities enforce bans as a condition of increased funding. So those last 2 points there also raise an interesting question. So first, it would seem like the governor's hands are tied in some ways in addressing this issue without some sort of funding source, that's signed off through the legislature, you would think. And then also, still Representative Auerkamp, I know we spoke last, and you seemed hesitant along going that route of addressing the issue with money. So if there's enforcement of bans tied to increased funding, does that change your opinion at all?
I think it opens up the conversation, and as we talked a few months ago about this issue, the important thing is that we don't want to waste money. We're spending taxpayers' dollars, and so it's very important that if money is being spent on the topic of homelessness, then the cities and the counties, whoever's responsible for spending that money, they're following best practices, and I think that's the critical point. And I think there's certainly, it's very important to take a look at what cities can do on their own without going to the state. And I think there's a lot of good examples of cities who don't come to the state and ask for state dollars because they've got the issue taken care of.
Okay. Some examples that you have?
I think Manhattan,
Okay.
let's get we have to understand everybody wants somebody else's money. Everybody wants more money for sure. I don't think there's an organization out there that wouldn't ask for more money. So we have to keep that that understood. But you take a look at Manhattan. They came into our interim committee and they said we don't have a problem because we work together as a city, all the organizations. We take this seriously and we address the issue and we don't ignore it. And we've also seen other cities that are now trying to address the issue because they kind of have been ignoring it for a while and they tend to have more problems. And so it was very encouraging to see just in this past month, we've had a few cities come present to the committee and they went through all the efforts that they've just started, for the most part, to look at this issue. And so I think cities are starting to realize, yes, they need to be kind of on the front line. And I was very encouraged, and so were many of the committee members, to hear what the cities are doing. Because I think this time last year, there wasn't a whole lot happening in a few cities to address the homelessness issue.
And based on that, you said that there is some sort of legislation in the works, right?
We are having a hearing on a bill next Tuesday that does talk about funding. It's a matching grant from the state to local cities, counties. And there are a lot of policy parts of that bill as well, as far as requirements for those cities and counties to enforce their laws, have certain laws in the books. There's clawbacks. There's a lot of details in that, which we'll look forward to having the hearing on Tuesday.
Okay, and we'll talk a little bit about that in just a second here. Devin, I wanted to get your opinion on what actions lawmakers can take to address this issue. Is there any particular legislation that you have in the works or would suggest from the Cicero Institute?
Sure. So there's a couple of, homelessness is a very complex issue. It's not a one-size-fits-all, and that's, I think, the most important takeaway, because a lot of the policy that's been dominated by the federal government and federal funding coming into states has been this sort of one-size-fits-all known as housing first. And I think that states, the needs of homeless individuals in Kansas are going to be different from the needs of homeless individuals in California or in Mississippi. And within that, not every homeless person is the same. So I think, one thing that really comes to mind in relation to Kansas is that over the last 10 years, the number of unsheltered homeless people, that's the most vulnerable kind of bracket of homelessness, the people who are sleeping on the street, who are in tents, who are in parks. Severe mental illness has doubled. It's quadrupled as that population has doubled in the last 10 years in Kansas. So while some numbers of homelessness have improved marginally, we're seeing that the remainder is in a more precarious position, a more perilous set of circumstances between mental health, substance abuse, and being without shelter. So for this, whether it's a municipal government or the state government, thinking about the needs of the individuals who are sleeping outside or sleeping on public land, whether it's city land or in front of businesses, or in the case of the state, on state land and parks and elsewhere, that's where we need to have a last resort. When a homeless outreach team from a services organization fails to get someone to come off the street and into services, that's when government needs to step in and law enforcement needs to step in and make sure that individual who might be suffering from very severe mental illness or in the throes of addiction is getting the help. And that sort of last resort is something that we've seen a lot of success in other places. In Austin, Texas, the city removed a ban on street camping in 2018, and they saw rates of unsheltered homelessness skyrocket. In 2021, they reinstated that ban, and with only one arrest, they were able to reduce that unsheltered population by about 20% and move those individuals into shelters. That's a continued effort. It's not the only solution, but it's something that tomorrow cities and the states can be doing on the land that they have control over.
Okay, and I noticed that is something that your organization has advocated for in the past, criminalizing public camping. So Missouri, they actually implemented that law at the state level, which was then struck down by the Supreme Court last year. The way it was passed, though, as an amendment in another piece of legislation, was found to violate the state's constitution. Also, there has been some pushback regarding policies like this. Opponents say that this sort of policy doesn't address the issue, but instead hides it. So what are your thoughts on that?
So I think that there's a misunderstanding of that kind of legislation. Even just the use of criminalizing it. It's not about adding something to the criminal statutes. It's about empowering law enforcement to intervene when an individual is in crisis. If someone is sleeping on the street, they are in crisis. In most states, there's available shelter space for them. And the fact that the individual is not doing that is usually indicative of them, again, being in a state of crisis due to mental health or substance abuse. So law enforcement is a last resort, as I was saying. There are many organizations who are doing outreach, but those organizations will admit that there are treatment and service-resistant individuals. For that classification of people, that's where there needs to be more solutions. So it's not about hiding it. It's not about just getting it out of the public's eye. There's a very real danger from street camping, foremost for the individuals that are homeless themselves. I mean, the mortality rate of an unsheltered homeless person is 2.5 times that of a sheltered homeless person. It's undeniable. They're often victims of crime. Many of them can be involved in other types of crimes as well, as just a function of their precarious position, but they themselves are victims of crimes, often from other homeless people. So it's a difficult problem. It's a difficult population. The camping ordinances and camping bans are not meant to punish them. It is meant to help them access services that, because of their state of mind, they may not be willing to accept otherwise.
Okay, thank you both. We'll be right back. You're watching Inside Kansas Politics.
Five, four, three, two, one. Let's go! It's time to go racing! Here we go! We have a car up and over.
IndyCar from the streets of St. Petersburg, March 10th on NBC and Peacock.
Have you ever encountered a leprechaun? Well, March 16th is your lucky day for meeting one at Blarney Breakfast. Rise and shine early for the all-you-can-eat breakfast buffet served at Blind Tiger Brewery and Restaurant from 7 to 10 a.m. Enjoy a delicious breakfast, drinks, raffles, and more, all while celebrity servers earn tips for a great cause. All proceeds help your friends with disabilities served at Capper Foundation experience building their abilities, like kids learning to walk and talk, and adults getting a job in the community. Get advance tickets only at these locations.
Oh, there's something so real about living local, and I know without a doubt I'm not alone. And I'm loving living local. There's nowhere else I'd rather be. KSNT is living local. It's the only kind of air I want to breathe. Northeast Kansas is where I love to be.
The #1 entertainment talk show is giving you more of what you love.
Please. Oh, that was abrupt. More stars.
More laughs.
And more.
It's time to play Star.
I'm sorry you didn't win a mug or a t-shirt.
I don't like you anymore, Mark.
Get more of what you love.
Want more?
Ooh, we've got more.
With Live.
Weekdays at 11 on 27 KSNT.
It's so hard to predict a sick kid who just keep getting sicker, but we needed to be together as a family. My family is my entire life. My family means the world to me.
When we're together and we have support from Ronald McDonald House, we can be a little stronger. They provide food and a place to rest your head, and they will help you through every step. That's what gets you through every day when you don't know how else you're gonna make it.
It makes you feel like you're not alone.
Would you rather hear about sports from people who like to talk sports, or hear from the people who actually play and coach sports?
The best predictor of future success is past success.
K-Nation has the interviews and coverage you want for all things KU and K-State.
When you do the small things correctly, big things will happen.
Join us every Sunday night after 27 News at 10 for another exciting week of K-Nation. Sponsored by 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline.
Welcome back to Inside Kansas Politics. I'm Rebecca Chung. We're continuing our conversation on homelessness now. When we talk about enforcing a statewide policy that criminalizes public camping or sets certain restrictions, could this not be considered stepping on local officials' toes? So what if they don't see this as the proper way to address the issue in their community? And I'll give each of you a chance to respond to that.
Let me start.
Representative Bauer. Mm-hmm.
Certainly, the local control is very important for the cities and the counties, and we have to maintain a balance. We don't want to overreach the state's role, and it's difficult. Where is that line? Where do we stop? I don't know exactly where that line is on this topic, but when we have property owners and business owners who are asking their local elected officials to address a problem and there's no response, the problem is not being addressed, the local businesses and homeowners are kind of abandoned. And so where do they go next? A lot of times they'll ask the state, what can you do to help? And so from our perspective at the state, it's, well, how do we encourage or maybe require those local governments to follow their own laws, to have equal application of the laws. We saw that very clearly, I believe, in the interim committee when we had certain business owners from Lawrence talk about their experiences when they asked for help, when homeless individuals were going to the bathroom in front of their properties or threatening their employees. And the response was pretty much nothing. They were given no help. And what do we do from the state's perspective? If you or I did these same things, we would be put in jail. Right? There would be reaction from the police officers. But for some odd reason, they couldn't have anything done because the individual was homeless. And to a lot of Kansans, business owners, that's unreasonable. And so they need a solution. They need to have some relief from the issues that they face every day. There's no reason why a business owner should not get some support when their employee is being threatened walking from their car to their workplace. That's ridiculous. And so, yeah, we have to look at where is the balance, but we also have to make sure that we're protecting all Kansans.
Okay.
But it's going to be a distinction.
Yeah. Devin, what are your thoughts on that? Local
Sure.
control, and is this stepping on local officials' toes, do you think?
I think it's important to remember that when it comes to homelessness, the kind of level of government that has the most control is the federal government. The federal government has dominated the homelessness policy space for about 30 years. It is the majority of the funding, in the case of Kansas, to the tune of $50 million over the last 5 years. And the federal government, through its funding mechanism to these organizations that are within states called continuums of care, all of state activities around homelessness are coordinated through these continuums of care that are, again, dominated by federal funding and thus federal policy. So when we start to discuss something like a camping ban or prioritization of short-term versus long-term shelter, there's an undeniable federal presence in there that is dominating then the local government conversation. So one of the important roles for states is to be a balancing act of saying, look, this policy, the origins of some of these policies that are happening in our communities, it isn't organically coming from local government. It's coming from HUD, from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. So there's a tricky balance of you want to have local control, but when the scale is tipped so much in favor of the federal government in these communities, it's an important role for the state to be sort of an arbiter of what is the Kansas approach to solving homelessness that's separate from D.C., that's separate from Washington's influence in its communities, that is really an authentic approach that the state wants to take, and that reflects the desires of those communities. It's easy to get drowned out, and I think that's where some of this is coming from, and a lot of the states that have worked on this issue, this is one of the ways that they're trying to reassert the local and state level influence on this policy.
Okay. Now, there are consequences, I would say, to not taking action to address this issue. What are some feasible solutions? And also, should the state take action this year? Is that already planned? Representative Outerkamp, if you wanted to start.
So I guess it's defining the terms. What do we mean by taking action from the state level? I think what was just said about the federal government dominating, I think certainly the funding, but there's a reference to what's the Kansas way, but I think we need to first start is what's the Topeka way, what's the Lawrence way, what's the Wichita way, because the people on site, they're gonna know what their city's needs are better than we are in Topeka, and certainly better than the federal government. And so as far as taking action, I think the first and most important thing is what action is being taken at the local level. Is there good action? Are there good examples in Kansas? Something that we can show other cities and try to break down those barriers of political egos or whatever the case may be, to where we can start kind of talking city to city and understand what are the best practices that some are finding that maybe they can change a little bit in this city, but start doing similar things that are successful. I think that's the first and most important thing. We have to start at the local level, and that's what we've kind of been trying to do on our committee. We first brought in a couple national level people to talk about the topic more on a macro scale, and then we brought in a couple cities to talk about what they are doing to address the issue. And it's not easy, right? As has been said, it's a complex issue. There's so many different ways to look at it, and it seems to be continually changing. One of the presentations we heard earlier this year is about the efforts in San Antonio, Texas. It's very interesting. The mayor down there worked with a business leader in the community to get a board together to address the issue. The first step they took was they took 2 years to research what was being done around the country, to really understand what are the best practices, so that when they finally put forth a plan, they were pretty convinced it would be successful. And so, as far as the state's action this year, it may just simply be helping the cities present their plans so other cities can have more access to them. We're still waiting for Lawrence. Lawrence has a kind of a large-scale plan that they've just recently put together. We asked them to send that to the committee. They agreed. We're still waiting to see that. But just to where they can start sharing information. Will we get to a policy? Will we get to maybe funding with strings attached? I don't know. But at least for now, I think it's very important to kind of just shine a light on the topic and let the cities come and explain what they're doing so that we can continue to learn, so that when we finally do implement a policy or maybe funding, we're going to make sure it's going to be effective.
Okay, and Devin, what are your thoughts on that? What sort of conversations are you having with the legislature?
Sure. So I want to echo the importance of the legislature's engagement with communities and just facilitating discussions about this issue. I think that's of foremost importance, since, again, so much of the policy discussions about this have occurred in the last 30 years, far away. So bringing that conversation, home and into these communities, I think is one of the best ways that the legislature can be involved, even if they don't pass anything, facilitating that conversation. The one thing that comes to mind that is uniquely fit for the state to do would be camping bans on state lands. Municipalities are not able to enforce their ordinances on that land, and this could be an overpass, state highways, that sort of thing. That's, I think, one that only the state could take action on, and is certainly an important. It's not the only solution. It's a part of making sure people are accessing services and not avoiding them by staying on state land, especially if a community is enacting a prohibition on street camping in their community. If the state is not also doing that, then they can just simply move to an overpass and avoid responsibility. So that's one that comes to mind. And then, certainly there are other options around creating what are called, structured camping facilities, which is when someone might be resistant to shelter or services, but and is insisting on remaining with a tent or a sleeping bag, then these are designated areas that have sanitary facilities and access to services and some security to secure order. That's where they can camp and kind of get on the on-ramp to then getting into shelter and transitioning out of homelessness. But those are things that I think, as the representative said, as communities chart their course and the state finds how much of a role it wants to play, it's dependent on a lot of other factors.
Okay, and I wanted to circle back to this bill that you're talking about. Is this the one that would designate money, about $40 million, to this issue regarding homeless shelters and infrastructure, things like that?
The language of the bill that was introduced, yes, has that.
Okay, and is that so there are strings attached though, so it would include those enforcement of public camping bans? Is that what you're?
Yeah, there's several policies, and that's Yeah, we'll have the hearing on it next Tuesday to dive into the details. I'm sure that we'll have a lot of people come in to testify, a lot of the cities, and they'll be able to explain or the cause or the effects of those strings attached to the funding, and which ones they see as being effective and which ones they see as kind of being overly burdensome for their efforts. And then there's going to be a lot of pushback on the $40 million, which is a tremendous amount of money. And I think there's a pushback in one of the budget committees when it got brought up, because there's just no real proof that we will have positive effects by spending $40 million or $10 million or $4 million. So I think there's going to be a lot of pushback on just throwing money at the issue without having a very clear plan that will show positive outcomes.
I know a lot of community shelters in Kansas advocate for the housing first approach. And so it circles back to that argument, is housing first a viable solution for something like this? And should we invest more in housing to solve this issue? What are your thoughts on that? And are you open to hearing conversations about that if there are maybe requirements for seeking treatment or for addiction or mental health, if tied to housing first or taking a housing first approach and investing in housing?
I mean, we're open to about any discussion, and we're going to have them in committee. We've already had them many times. Once again, it's just taking the time to walk through and first learn from what others have done and make sure that that is the best next step. And from talking to a few people and also a lot of the presentations we've had at our committee, it would seem that the most effective thing is the transitional housing. That's where people can go, and it's a little bit more personal, and the intention is, let's figure out what the needs are and how to move forward now. Sometimes with the permanent housing, I would say the results are that people kind of get lost and they don't receive what they need, and the effects are not good. So, and also I would argue permanent housing would be much more expensive than transitional housing. That's where we're just continuing to gather the data, just to make sure that, before we're spending other people's money, if that's even still on the table after the hearing, we make sure we're doing it the right way.
I was seeing that Cicero Institute also advocates for that short-term housing solution. My question is, how long would that short-term period be? Because it does seem like it may take some time before someone could get back on their feet, build stability, get a job, things like that. Are those factored into that sort of policy?
Certainly. So I think that a lot of the Cicero Institute's position on housing first comes down to a couple different components of it. And one is the permanent aspect of it, that permanent supportive housing, which is the core component of housing first. Housing first, as a philosophy, has two major components. One, that permanent supportive housing, which is a subsidized living space for an individual that has no requirements for treatment and sobriety. That is written into the policy. We take issue with a number of issues there. Foremost, that there's no off-ramp. So the idea is that if you simply give this to them, that person will be successful. The other part is the accountability. So harm reduction is this concept of not requiring treatment, not requiring sobriety. If someone is using drugs in one of these facilities, then under federal policy and these mandates for harm reduction with Housing First, they can't be evicted. Now, that not only can enable the individual, but it can jeopardize the individuals who are around them. So when they have these complexes, these permanent supportive housing facilities, if you're someone who's trying to get sober, trying to get back on your feet as a formerly homeless person, and you're next door in a unit to someone who is openly using methamphetamine or fentanyl, and you go to your building manager and they say, sorry, we can't evict them, That's devastating. And what we found is that in some, there's not a ton of research behind Housing First. People will say, oh, it's an evidence-based policy. But it's not as simple as that. The National Academy of Sciences have found that Housing First has no positive impact on the health of homeless people. Most studies have found that it's not terribly cost effective. And those that have found it usually have weak methodology. One of the most rigorous studies of Housing First was in Denver, and of a permanent supportive housing facility, and they compared it to folks who were not offered that and were on the street getting services as usual. The people who had permanent supportive housing had a 50% higher death rate than those who were not offered that. So we have to dig in deeper. We can't just say, oh, Housing First is being spoken about widely, thus it must be the right answer. A lot of that's rhetoric. A lot of that's not digging into the details of what's actually going on. What does fidelity to the Housing First model look like? How is that impacting some of these things? There's a lot of questions that we just don't know about it. And taking a one-size-fits-all approach, saying that housing is the main issue, underestimates the complexity of homelessness. As we said earlier, the mental health rates have quadrupled. Today, if you are the permanent supportive housing supply, Housing First, has been implemented in Kansas for the last 10 years. They've doubled their permanent supportive housing supply. They've cut their transitional housing in half. In that same 10-year period, if you are mentally ill and homeless, you are 2.5 times as likely today to be without shelter than in 2013. It's not working. These people are falling through the cracks. The most vulnerable are falling through the cracks. When we had transitional housing, when we had double the transitional housing we do today, we're in a better position.
All right, very complex issue, a lot to unpack. We're going to be continuing our conversation after the break. You're watching Inside Kansas Politics.
Of course I know the theme song.
Entertainment tonight, that's what people want.
It's hard to think of entertainment tonight without it.
Oh, I know it!
I mean, come on, since I was a little kid.
This is Entertainment Tonight. This is the Bible of show business.
Weeknights at 6:30.
Welcome back to Inside Kansas Politics. I'm Rebecca Chung. We're continuing our conversation and now getting input from people that are on the grounds in Kansas. Joining me now is Christina Ashe-Guidry. She's the Director of Policy and Planning for United Community Services of Johnson County. And I'm also joined by Emily Wagner, Executive Director of Manhattan Emergency Shelter, Inc. All right. Now, Housing First, I understand, is an approach that some homeless shelters across Kansas advocate for, but there has also been some pushback about whether that approach is enough. So let's start with how this approach works based on what you're seeing implemented in your communities. And Christina, I wanted you to start there, but also I understand you have some new information that you wanted to present.
Yeah, so it's great to be back, Rebecca. I just want to remind folks, so in Kansas, we do have a coordinated response to homelessness that's led by continuums of care. There are 5 of them that cover the entire state. And so we are tasked with responsibilities that include counting individuals experiencing homelessness each year and tracking those trends, as well as coordinating application for federal funding. And then we also coordinate all the public and private partners working in this space around the delivery of homelessness prevention and homelessness services for Kansans who need it. And so we can tell you, looking at our data from counting homelessness in 2022, we saw about an 11% increase in overall homelessness from 2021. And then again in 2023, we counted another 9% increase in homelessness. So obviously that's concerning. And when we look at those figures, we want to be clear that while every individual has unique circumstances, circumstances that leads them into homelessness, and Emily here could share many of those stories. In fact, there are systemic underlying reasons that we see an overall increase in homelessness. And so we want to be clear that one of those very driving reasons is that Kansas has a lack of affordable housing. It's actually an acute shortage. It's well documented by the state. And on top of that, I'm sure you're aware that we have seen about a 25% increase in inflation in just the past 5 years. So in Kansas, I think most people don't realize that actually over 800,000 Kansans are considered low income. So that means that they're living in a household that if it's a family of 3, they're making $46,000 or less a year. So when you think about 25% inflation over the past 5 years, or the most recent rental statistic that we have is that the state of Kansas saw an 11% average rental increase last year. Those families cannot afford that incredible increase in rental cost, and so that is pricing them out of housing. So where that takes us as continuums of care is that it's very clear that there are solutions, but it's going to take threefold approach. So first, we're going to have to build and maintain affordable housing where Kansans need it. Second, we are going to have to act upstream to stem the tide. We have to stop this overall increase of more people falling into homelessness. And third, we have to provide adequate investment in services plus housing for Kansans who are already experiencing homelessness. And we can talk about specific legislation that's on the table or projects that fall into each of those categories.
Okay, and then also when it comes to how this approach is implemented in your community, how would you say that's worked out so far in Johnson County?
So this is, so across the state, this requires everyone. Okay. So we have regional level responses, and that is led by continuums of care. And so the continuum of care is going to work with localities, they're going to work with private agencies, with shelters, and they're just going to kind of coordinate everybody together. But every region has very different needs. So we can tell you in Johnson County right now, our biggest priority is putting together a year-round shelter for single individuals. So we are working really hard on that as our key priority. Manhattan, on the other hand, Emily leads an amazing shelter there. Do you want to talk about?
Sure.
Yeah.
So in Manhattan, we have services to help homeless. We have some of those safety net services. We don't have affordable housing. We don't have good housing for seniors. We don't have good housing for disabled, and just affordable. I run a 47-bed homeless shelter for men, women, and families with children, and we are full all of the time. But we have great agencies. We have worked really hard to bring other programs into town to help combat how many people we're seeing and the increases we're seeing. What we're really struggling with practicing housing first is not having enough affordable housing to make it work. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. That system would work great if we could just find the housing for people and put them in it. We can provide the wraparound services to keep them housed, but it's finding the housing first.
Okay, and as I understand, before we move on to the next topic, as I understand, there is a bill currently in the State House that would, I believe, designate about $40 million to homeless shelters, infrastructure, but there are some strings attached to that as well. Where do you stand on this particular legislation?
Yeah, so we are, first, Rebecca, really excited that the legislature is interested in putting a significant investment in infrastructure. We want to be clear, though, that different regions of the state have really different needs. And so if we're suggesting a bill that's going to address homelessness infrastructure, it shouldn't just be for emergency shelter, because there are many parts of the state that really need other types of housing supports. So for example, in Manhattan, you guys don't have permanent supportive housing, and it's like in a 9-county region that there's no permanent supportive housing. And so what they need is to access funding for permanent supportive housing infrastructure. Other areas don't have transitional housing. So Rebecca, transitional housing is for folks like transitional age youth who are coming out of foster care who need a couple of years to complete education and then get jobs and then be stable. So we would say that the scope of that should be broader. And then of course there's also a provision there that would require localities that access the funds enforce local camping and vagrancy ordinances. And we want to be clear that we have a couple of responses to that. The first is that's not an effective response. If you are taking folks who are outside who don't have somewhere else to go during the day because there's no day program or at night because there's no shelter, and you say, well, I'm going to give you a ticket or I'm going to arrest you because you don't have somewhere else to go, then you have exerted a lot of law enforcement resources. You have engaged the court system, potentially the jail system, and at the end of the day, what are you going to do? You're going to put those people back out in public spaces again. You haven't connected them to housing, you haven't connected them to services, so all you've done is use taxpayer money to move people for 24 hours, 15 minutes. So really what we are saying is we have to use that money effectively. So the second point there is that that's really violates local control. So we know that Kansans across the state are really concerned about housing. There's clear statistics on that. The Kansas Speak survey from October of 2023, 71.6% of Kansans are concerned about the price of housing. So our local governments are they're keenly aware of the need to address homelessness and housing, and they are crafting local responses. So if you look across the state, you can see different localities doing different things. And they have to do different things because they all have different resources, they have different priorities. And so some areas are using crisis intervention teams and using those to help break down encampments and connect people to services like Topeka. Others use mental health co-responders to help stabilize people, or they use street outreach workers to connect people with continuums of care. But those responses have to be based on local resources. It's really overreach for the state to just kind of create an edict that everybody has to do the same thing.
Gotcha. Okay. So with that particular legislation, that's something, a concern you would raise?
Yes.
Gotcha. Okay. Speaking of services, looking at some of these Housing First programs, I'm not finding where it says that participating in mental health services or drug treatment programs is a requirement to receive housing. So for example, in Lawrence, this was written up about their housing intervention program in 2021, but they said that there's no sobriety mandate because they're encouraging recovery at any stage. And then it also noted that treatment or service acceptance or compliance are not required. So I wanted to get a better understanding of why that is, and should it be a requirement for people that are suffering from serious mental health issues or drug addiction when they're seeking housing?
So, Rebecca, right now in Kansas, every different kind of shelter, every different program sets their own policies and programs. And so it's just up to them. And so there is a school of thought that says, yes, like we really should make sure that we are sheltering everyone. We don't want anyone to be outside. We don't want anyone to be unsafe. And so even if you're not sober, you could come in. Now, I don't know of any program that would let you come in with illegal substances. Like those would be removed from you at the door. And I think that it's clear that no matter what your state of housing is, you can't force people to accept therapy. You can't force people to change. You can ask them, you can remind them, you can case manage them and say, hey, what are your goals? Let's recognize what are your barriers to being housed and staying housed. And so that's what all of our case managers do. We're all saying, hey, like, let's work on your barriers together. Let's work on sobriety. Let's work on mental health. But just like I couldn't force my child to go to therapy and engage productively, you can't force an independent, any person to do that. So I think that that's just what Housing First kind of recognizes.
I think in Manhattan, our The Manhattan Emergency Shelter is a low barrier shelter. That is normally what shelters are. We do have the requirement you have to be sober and you can't bring drugs and alcohol into the facility. I've also run Housing First programs. I think a lot of what it comes down to is good case management and good staff and wraparound services. We are successful because we take case management seriously. I did case management for 10 years before I was the director for these last 13. And so I ingrain that in my staff. Case management is important. These individuals are in crisis and they need help. They need help navigating the system that is very difficult to navigate and even know where to get services. You call places and you're turned down because they don't have the services. We just don't have adequate drug and alcohol services, mental health services, or housing case management services. And so what I have done with the shelter is we have ingrained case management into everyone's stay that comes, no matter how long they stay. And 80% of our clients move from shelter into permanent housing. That's our goal as a shelter, is to get people into permanent housing. And we're successful doing that and convincing and talking and having real honest conversations with our clients about the services that will make them successful in housing. Because our clients want to be housed. They need to have the resources to be successful in that housing. And that is where our jobs come in to help them do that.
Then, as you mentioned, having that sobriety mandate, right? Has that helped at all in, maybe pushing that along so that they are able to look at treatment a little bit differently and say, hey, if I want to maintain this living circumstance, I'm going to have to sober up. Is that something that's helped?
That has helped.
Okay.
And we have clients that they really need that structure of being in a shelter. The problem we're running into right now is there's just not the services to get people into. I have individuals come to me and they want treatment. They want help, and I don't have anywhere to send them because there's nowhere with beds, or I have to send them clear to Dodge City, which transportation is an issue. Getting them back to the area is an issue. So it's a lack of other wraparound services that come into the Housing First concept that make it difficult right now in Kansas because we don't have those services to help.
Well, thank you both. We'll be right back. You're watching Inside Kansas Politics.
There's so many reasons to watch Kelly.
I can't even focus on what you're talking about right now. Aquaman wins!
It's all on the Kelly Clarkson Show. Count me in. Weekdays.
Weekdays at 3 on 27 KSNT.
Have you ever encountered a leprechaun? Well, March 16th is your lucky day for meeting one at Blarney Breakfast. Rise and shine early for the all-you-can-eat breakfast buffet served at Blind Tiger Brewery and Restaurant from 7 to 10 a.m. Enjoy a delicious breakfast, drinks, raffles, and more, all while celebrity servers earn tips for a great cause. All proceeds help your friends with disabilities served at Capper Foundation experience building their abilities, like kids learning to walk and talk, and adults getting a job in the community. Get advance tickets only at the
You may not realize it, but these words, often used to describe someone with a mental health condition, can be very harmful. In a country where 1 in 5 people are affected by a mental health condition, it's time for all of us to step up and change the conversation. Just because someone's struggle isn't obvious on the outside doesn't mean they aren't hurting on the inside. We need to see the person, not the condition. Join with me, pledge to be stigma-free.
From the stories you should know.
They just ripped the ATM out of the wall.
Up in a Black Hawk helicopter.
To the stories you need to know.
Mattresses can turn into flying missiles.
From the stories that change the way you think.
Were you trying to rip me off? I think it's down there.
To the stories that affect the way you feel.
It's one big party.
Inside Edition.
These are the stories that impact your life.
Weekdays at 2 on 27 KSNT.
This is a fish, a clownfish actually. He lives in a reef like this, in an ocean like this. This ocean contains these currents. These currents help carry fishing boats like these. Fishing boats like these bring their catch to port. Their catch is loaded onto this truck and delivered to this restaurant. This restaurant serves dinner to this family. This family drives back to their home. Their home borders this forest. This forest surrounds this creek. This creek trickles into this river down to these mangroves. These mangroves buffer the coastline from this bay. This bay is a hunting ground for this shark. This shark swims out to this ocean. This ocean flows over this reef. This reef is home to this fish. This is a fish, a clownfish actually.
Welcome back to Inside Kansas Politics. I'm Rebecca Chung. We're wrapping up our conversation now. And the next question here I wanted to address is the consequence of inaction. Should lawmakers take action this year, and what could happen if no action is taken this year? How could that impact what you're seeing in your communities, Christina?
Well, so I think the great news, Rebecca, is that there's a lot of legislation on the table that could be really productive here. So we mentioned earlier that really this is we need a threefold solution here. We have to build and maintain affordable housing where Kansans need it. We have to act upstream to stem the tide of more people becoming homeless. And then we have to invest in our services plus housing for Kansans already experiencing homelessness. So when we're talking about building and maintaining affordable housing, the great news is that in 2022, there was bipartisan legislation passed called the Affordable Housing Tax Credit. And what that does is provide kind of matching funds to help developers build affordable housing in Kansas. So in 2023 was the first year it was in effect, and it has had profound effect. It is actually incredible. So what we were looking at in 2022 before this passed was that the state was only able to help support 491 units of affordable housing, but in 2023 with this new affordable housing tax credit, we're looking at almost 2,200 units. So that is a huge benefit, and that will really, as we continue that credit each year, that will really begin to help address our affordable housing shortage. Beyond that, I think we really have to talk about maintaining housing. So Kansas has an aging housing stock. A lot of the housing was built in like the 40s and the 50s, and we have just homes that need to be maintained, they need to be improved. We have, gosh, an awful lot of retirees who are living in kind of this aging housing and would like to age in place, but they don't have the money or the physical ability to maintain that themselves. And so what we have proposed is that we actually have a state housing trust fund, and one of the things that it does is actually do these kinds of maintenance programs. And then we have great private organizations like Habitat for Humanity that do this work. But the state housing trust fund doesn't get any state dollars. It only gets federal funding. And so what we have proposed is that the state would create a revenue source from the state to go to the state housing trust fund to help maintain those homes so that our retirees and our affordable housing can remain affordable. So then when we are talking about acting upstream to stem the tide, there are so many things that we could do there, Rebecca. There are like 5 or 6 bills I can think of off the top of my head. So really anything that is targeting our vulnerable Kansans who are most likely to lose housing, folks who are lower income or who are on fixed income, who are looking at that 11% rent increase for the second or third year in a row, and they're like, I just can't do it anymore. Like, you're pricing me out of my housing. So we could do, there's a child tax credit that was just proposed and had a hearing that would be great. It is like a stair-step tax credit, so folks with the lowest income would get the greatest benefit. There's also a proposal that just had a hearing that would extend homestead property tax relief to renters. Now, Kansas has done that up until 2014, and then they took it out. And so this is just returning it back. And so there's no loss to the landlord homeowner there because they couldn't claim that property tax credit in the first place because it's not their homestead, it's the renter's homestead. And the renter is already paying that property tax increase because their rent went up. And so that gives the renters a chance to kind of get back a little bit of that money. We could stop taxing Social Security income. I think there's bipartisan agreement that we should not be making retirees pay tax again on their Social Security. We could look at Medicaid expansion. I understand that Medicaid expansion might get a hearing later next month. And Medicaid expansion we know is really important because medical debt and lack of medical insurance is often kind of the trigger that cascades households into homelessness. So I think, gosh, is there anything you want to add there?
I just want to, I guess, the increase we've seen in our older folks coming in, 60 plus, has been mainly being priced out of their homes. I have a couple examples just from these last couple months. We had someone who his home had come to disrepair. It needed several fixes. The community that he was in basically gave him an ultimatum that it had to be fixed or he was going to lose the home that he had owned for 15 years. And he ultimately, we could not find resources to make the repairs, and he had to lose the home that he's lived in and owned for 15 years and paid taxes on, and then ended up in the homeless shelter. The difficulty we had then was finding housing that was appropriate for him because he needed some, he had some physical disabilities that he needed some easy entry, access to his apartment, wherever what we could find. So it took a while to find housing. It was frustrating. It was really sad to see because he worked so hard and he works every day, but just couldn't afford it. We had another gentleman who had some severe medical issues come up, which ultimately the cost of those is what drove him out of his place. Also, the landlord, he came to the end of his lease and the landlord was then upping the rent. He couldn't afford the new rent, and so his lease was non-renewed. Without a place at that point, severe medical disabilities, and then came to the shelter. We had to do a lot of case management work just to get him the medical care that he needed and the things that he would need in a home to live it on his own. And then we had to dive into how are we going to find housing that he can afford and where are we going to go with him. And so we were able to luckily find him some housing that he'll be safe in and that will be affordable. But it's difficult, and it would have been almost impossible for him to navigate on his own with his disabilities at this point. So we're definitely seeing it. The other thing we're seeing is our young folks coming in where wages just are not keeping up with housing. So they're graduating high school, they're graduating college sometimes, in secondary schools, and they just can't afford rent and what their starting salaries are. But to add to that and compound that, their parents are also in financial situations because of the economy where they can't afford to help the kids with rent. And so we've been seeing a lot of young adults coming where it is just a financial situation. They make too little to afford the housing in the area.
And we'd really like to just remind folks that we're all part of the same housing market. And so when there is just fundamentally a lack of affordable housing, then the situation that we have, and that has been documented in Kansas, is that retirees can't sell their big family home and downsize because there's nowhere for them to downsize to. And so then your young professionals can't buy their first home because there's not a home available, and your young families that need to move into that larger home that maybe a retiree is in can't move there because the retiree's there already. So the whole housing market gets locked up, and that's because, again, we don't have enough affordable housing. So that is such a key component to making everyone in Kansas comfortable and living in housing that fits their needs.
Okay, thank you both again. And that was your look inside Kansas politics. If you want to keep up to date on all things Kansas politics, then follow us on social media. Follow us on X at NKS Politics, and on Facebook, just search Inside Kansas Politics. We'll also post the full video on YouTube. Just search KSNT News, and check ksnt.com/inside-kansas-politics for past episodes. If you have a story you want Kansas state legislators to hear or topics you think we should cover, let us know. You can email us at ikp@ksnt.com. We'll see you right here, same time, same place. Have a good day.